The purpose of today's hearing is to hear from tribal leaders and originally from the Bureau of Indian Affairs about land fractionation, land consolidation, and the challenges that Indian tribes and individual Indian landowners face as a result. Land fractionation is the result of the policies implemented by the federal government for American Indians during what we refer to as the allotment period. Beginning with the General Allotment Act of 1887, the federal government divided tribal lands into 80 or 160-acre sections to be allotted to individual tribal members. Any land not allotted was sold off, which resulted in approximately 90 million acres of Indian land being removed from Indian ownership and control. Congress formally ended and repudiated the failed policy of allotment with the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, but the impacts are still felt today. Because individual Indian allotments initially followed state laws for inheritance, property interest in individually allotted lands were inherited by multiple heirs. When the original tribal owners died intestate, that is, without a will, the ownership of the land was divided equally amongst their heirs. But the physical land itself was not divided, resulting in co-ownership of the land between those heirs. As time passes and more generations die without writing wills, the number of co-owners with a fractionated interest increases exponentially. Many of the fractionated interest owners only have a small fraction of a claim to the land that they own. To put this into perspective, if a parcel of land earns $100 for grazing purposes and an individual interest owner has a 2% claim for that land, they would only receive $2. In 2018, after implementation of the land buyback program, the Department of the Interior estimated that there were 243,000 landowners who owned nearly 2.5 million interests in 100,000 fractionated parcels. As this subcommittee has explored in previous hearings, barriers to land use and the development of land in Indian country frequently discourage economic development and investment. Fractionated lands are another barrier to development because generally a majority interest is needed to make land use decisions. If an allotment has 50 or 100 co-owners, it can be unaffordable and logistically prohibitive to gain a majority interest agreement for land use. As a result, adjacent tribally controlled land can remain undeveloped and individual Indian landowners do not receive the benefits. Congress has attempted to address Indian land fractionation in multiple ways, through providing pathways for tribes to consolidate lands, creating and reforming the probate process for Native Americans, and also creating land buyback programs to purchase fractionated interest from willing sellers. The largest of which was the land buyback program that was part of the Cobell v. Salazar settlement. The Cobell settlement was negotiated by the Obama administration and funded through congressional legislation. $1.9 billion was set aside from the $3.4 billion settlement to make a concerted effort to resolve fractionation through a 10-year voluntary land buyback program. It has not been as successful as we had hoped. The buyback program conducted consolidation actions from 2012 to 2022 and set offers to 63,763 individual Indian landowners in 53 different locations. Ultimately, $1.69 billion was paid out to Indian landowners, increasing or creating tribal ownership in over 51,000 tracts of land, with 1,916 tracts reaching 100% tribal trust ownership. While this program made some progress in reducing land fractionation, the Department of the Interior's own final report included two statistics that I would like to highlight today. The program identified more than 2.9 million purchasable fractional interests, and after the program now there are still 2.4 million purchasable fractional interests remaining. And even with the considered 10-year efforts of the buyback program, without further action, the rate of fractionization will bypass pre-buyback program levels in just 14 years. It is obvious that funding massive buyback programs is not the be-all and end-all in ending land fractionization. We have to do better for Indian country. There are further policies-focused opportunities to reduce land fractionation and purchase consolidation within Indian reservations. This hearing today will have our witnesses talk about their experiences with the land buyback program and what other efforts tribes, organizations, and individual landowners, Indian landowners, are taking to prevent further fractionization of land interests. We can all work towards cohesive, interrelated solutions that prevent further fractionization and advocate for informed land management. This hearing continues this conversation that has been happening now for decades. I want to thank the witnesses for being with us today. I look forward to your testimony. One of the things that I really appreciate that you've brought today is you've brought solutions. We don't always see that. We don't always see where our witnesses come in and have a list of things that they think need to be done to address the issue that is creating the problem at hand. So I appreciate that. Congress sometimes doesn't always act in as quickly as you would think or that you would want, but at the same time, bringing this list to us allows us to better focus on what is actually going to be a solution. Because a lot of times I think government is always trying to fix its last solution, and that becomes very inefficient and very wasteful of our resources. I especially appreciate the comment that we need to be interpreting regulations and statutes in favor of the tribes and in favor of resolving the issue rather than creating more barriers. That's another thing as an attorney who has dealt with regulations and administrative agencies for decades. I feel that so much of the work that our agencies do is to create barriers rather than to create roadmaps. And I appreciate the idea of coming up with more ideas or coming up with more solutions as to how these things can be interpreted to actually address and solve the problem rather than creating more problems or more barriers. I also want to note that that land buyback program spent $1.69 billion to reduce land fractionation on reservation lands. But the fractionization has still not on a consistent basis been on a downward trajectory. So we need to consider the fact of whether just throwing more money or providing more money for this is the solution, or whether there are other ways that we can address this. Again, with your expertise, your knowledge of the on-the-ground situation, I think that you are absolutely in the best position to educate us on those other opportunities. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Weatherwax. In your testimony, you note that the Blackfeet Nation has utilized innovative technology when it comes to land management. Could you elaborate just a bit further on that, and also if it would be useful to have regional organizations collaborate on land management? If you could just tell us a bit about some of the innovative things that you have done for land management.
Oh, for land management, we've used GPS, the GPS system, historic maps and photos to try to give the tribe the most accurate picture of land ownership and jurisdictional issues. We're tracking land with our own software because we do not have access to TAMs. We have had to reinvent the wheel because we don't have access to the concise federal database.
Well, then maybe that's one of the areas that we could address. And I appreciate Mr. Steinbrook's comments about the fact that sometimes with this mapping program, it was the first time that our tribes even had a map of their lands, which is rather stunning to me as I sit here in 2024 to learn that. So I appreciate that information because I think mapping and understanding what is there is absolutely critically important in terms of knowing where we go from here. Mr. Steinbrook, well, and Mr. LeBeau, I'm going to go to you next. I just have a quick comment. You indicated that your allotments for your ranchers or for your cattle producers is about 1,000 acres per, and it takes 28 acres per cow-calf pair, which means that each 1,000 acres would sustain about 35 head of cattle, which coming from a ranch, that doesn't seem like a lot. That seems to be a very restrictive way to raise livestock. Have you found that there are ways that we can increase that to increase the economic development and opportunity for our tribal members? And he just interrupted me, but that's okay because we like Dusty. That we can increase that allotment or increase those numbers so that we can have additional economic development for our tribal members in terms of cattle production.
Yes, that would be great if we could increase the production. One way is to study the land. Perhaps the grass can support more animals, calf cow pair than originally thought. And the other way was be to do the land buyback, thoroughly through the reservations once again. So this program has helped our tribal members a lot, and we have benefited from it. And whether it was through farming or through ranching, we come from a reservation that has majority of our lands, super vast majority of our lands are used for ranching. So it makes sense for this program to continue once again. So